This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guests today are Johann Hari, who's just written a very interesting piece in The Nation magazine called The Wrong Kind of Green, and Christine McDonald, who's written the book Green Ink, an environmental insider reveals how a good cause has gone bad. Johann Hari, your article cites the comments of G77 climate negotiator Lumumba Diaping at the Copenhagen Climate Summit. He compared the action of some of the major environmental groups to the CIA and KGB during the height of the Cold War.
Never thought that one day I would accuse a civil society of such a thing. Dividing the G77 or helping divide G77 is simply something that should be left to the CIAs, the KGBs, and the rest. It's mind-boggling. And I say this having been the beneficiary of absolute support from civil society. Many of you may not know this. I come from southern Sudan. We've been through wars for almost 90% of our lives since independence. So I'm not sure what happened exactly to the civil society that I know, or at least knew.
That was G77 climate negotiator Lumumba Diaping at the Copenhagen Climate Summit. Johann Hari, can you respond to his comments?
I think we need to first of all stress something really important. We are not talking about all American environmental groups. It is really important for people to know if they want to know where to give money to, where to campaign with. Greenpeace, 350.org, Friends of the Earth do not accept corporate donations, and as a result do not have a compromised position on the climate science. Now, Lumumba was absolutely right that the behaviour of the big corporate green groups, Conservation International, TNC, and I'm afraid to a lesser but still significant degree the Sierra Club, is very compromised in terms of their approach to policy. I think there are two areas that you can see this in. One is their lobbying within the United States. The climate science, contrary to all the denialism that's been pumped out over the past few months, is actually really clear. By 2020, we need a 40% cut on the emission of warming gases into the atmosphere on 1990 levels if we are going to have a 50% chance of preventing catastrophic global warming. Now, the problem is, the reason for that is that's how we stay the right side of a 2 degrees centigrade rise in temperatures. Now, I know at first that doesn't sound like very much. If you go out one day and go out for a picnic and it gets colder by 2 degrees or it gets hotter by 2 degrees, you don't feel that bothered. But the global climate is not like a picnic. It's more like your body. If your body temperature increased by 2 degrees and didn't go back down, you would die. It's worth bearing in mind the gap between where we are now and the last ice age is only 6 degrees centigrade. We are setting ourselves on course to go that far in the opposite direction in just a century on some projections. Now, to understand how big that is, the last time the world warmed that rapidly by 6 degrees was 251 million years ago, and the result was almost everything on Earth died. The only thing that survived was a pig creature that had the Earth to itself for another 50 million years. So the climate science is pretty clear, it's pretty shocking, and it's not being supported by these groups. The cut that we need is absolutely clear, and yet when we need a 40% cut, these groups are cheering on pitiful 3% cuts as wonderful, great progress, brilliant, when they should be standing apart from the system and saying these cuts are woefully inadequate, they're way short of what the climate science tells us we need, and they will set us on a path to disaster. Now, it's hard to see why they would be so wantonly throwing aside climate science, other than the fact that they take money from these polluters. And it manifests itself in very strange ways. The Centre for Biological Diversity, who you quoted in your headlines, a terrific group who, again, don't take any money from corporations, launched a lawsuit after the EPA ruling, which said that the levels of warming gases in the atmosphere had to stay within a safe level for human habitation. So they launched a lawsuit saying, OK, the climate scientists tell us very clearly it needs to be 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. That's what the climate science says. The Sierra Club launched a lawsuit against it and lined up with people from the Bush administration in news stories saying this was ridiculous, this was unrealistic, this couldn't happen. Now, these groups claim they're operating within something called political reality. They say we have to acknowledge the political reality of what will pass in Washington. What they don't seem to realise is, in a conflict between political reality and physical reality will win. You can't stand at the edge of a rising sea or a supercharged hurricane and say, I'm sorry, Joe Lieberman says I can't deal with you today. We either deal with the atmosphere's demands or we live with the consequences. That's one area. So they're supporting woefully inadequate targets. They're cheering them on. They're handing out placebos to the public saying this is fine, this is great, we just need another democratic victory and it'll all be okay, when they should be amplifying our anger. The second issue is more complex to explain and buried in acronyms, which I apologise to your viewers for, but is really important. It's called RED. It's the Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation Programme. And it's at the absolute centrepiece of how we're going to build a global agreement to get beyond this. It failed at Copenhagen. It's going to have to be there in any agreement. And at the moment, it's based on a very worrying bargain supported by Conservation International and these other groups. When you're told that you're going to get a cut, when Barack Obama says we're going to cut emissions by 3% in the United States by 2020, woefully inadequate, that's his promise, you will naturally assume as an American citizen, oh right, so we're going to have fewer coal power stations, more wind power, more solar power, more tidal power. That's not true. Under the way RED works, supported by these lobbying organisations, what happens is they can go anywhere in the world and they can pay what they call a cut anywhere and count it as part of America's domestic cuts. So, for example, 20% of current emissions come from the cutting down of rainforests because trees store carbon out of the atmosphere. So what they're saying is, so if we pay for that deforestation to not happen, that will count as part of our cuts. At first, it sounds fine. The atmosphere doesn't care whether the carbon comes from, you know, a coal power station in Milwaukee or a rainforest in Congo. It doesn't care. Problem is, there are so many holes in this system that you can throw a planet through, and these groups have been supporting those holes. If I can just give you one example that illustrates it quite well. They set up a pilot project in Bolivia for this. TNC funded it with money from British Petroleum, American Electrical Power, Pacificor, very dodgy polluters, as you can tell. What they did is they said, we're saving this area of rainforest in Bolivia. That means 55 million tonnes of carbon won't go into the atmosphere. That's 55 million tonnes of prevented global warming gases. So in return, Pacificor and American Electric Power can emit 55 million tonnes somewhere else in the world. When Greenpeace went to study what happened, they found out it had all been a scam. The area that was protected was preserved, it's true. But the logging companies just went to the next area down and logged there. Indeed, in some instances, they used the money they've been paid to not log that rainforest in order to go into the next place and log even more. That problem is called leakage. It basically means you appear to be preserving a rainforest, but all you're doing is displacing the cutting of the rainforest from one area to another. But yet, in return, that company will still emit more back in the United States. So what you're doing is a system that appears to be dealing with global warming, but is in fact locking in and spurring more global warming. It's very dangerous, and it's hard to see how a sincere environmental organisation, rather than one that was being funded by polluters, would support anything of the kind.
Johann Hari, you quote Jim Hansen, the world-renowned climatologist from the NASA Institute, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies of NASA. You start by referring to Sierra Club's chief climate counsel, David Bookbinder, ridiculing the center's attempts to make 350 parts per million a legally binding requirement